see you all. Last time we began by speaking about this process of awakening, how we sort of wake up to life. And we talked about the way that we often close down to life because we are running away from pain, holding on to pleasure, and ignoring most of our experience, which is neutral, right? Which we find boring because it isn't doing anything exciting to us. And then when we're willing to stop that process of running away and grasping, and we're willing to just be present, truth can emerge. The genuine nature of our actual experience, what's actually happening inside of us, what's actually happening in the world around us. And in that moment of just opening to the actual nature of our experience, we can begin to change. Really without almost any effort. Just the effort of opening to the genuine nature of our experience starts to bring the change. And this change can happen, as we just experienced today, at any moment. We can start afresh at any moment. Indeed, mindfulness is often about abandoning the past and the future. Right? Yes, all these things have happened. Yes, we've lost our attention 1,000 times. Yes, we've been distracted 1,000,000 times. But at this moment, the moment that you notice you've been distracted, you're aware. Right? That very moment you notice, you're totally aware, you're totally present, and you'll lose it again. But that's okay. Or you just come back again and again to that present moment. And as we start to do that, we start to touch a little bit more deeply our genuine nature, who we actually are. And we realize, for many of us, that we're not nearly as bad as we thought we were. Actually, we're pretty okay. When we start to touch what's actually happening inside, that genuine lightness inside, we can start to really accept ourselves. And paradoxically enough, when we start to genuinely accept ourselves just as we are, then we're able to change. Then the transformation comes. In Hasidic thought, the Hasidim are famously suspicious of guilt, of ashma, right? And the Besh taught, Keta Shem Tov, that guilt is actually the tool of the Yetzer Hara. And its goal is to make us think that we're terrible people, and therefore we can't change, right? So I'm terrible, I might as well give up now, because I've lost the game already. But instead we need to recognize that actually our genuine nature is divine. Our genuine nature is that we are Chelek Elohim Ma'al, we are a piece of divinity right here on earth, right here in presence. And if we can touch it, we can always just act and transform from that piece of our divine nature. Which doesn't mean there isn't an important place to reflection. For instance, the Hasidim say charata, regret, is very important, very significant. You want to notice what I've done, have regret, and do everything I can to transform any pain I've caused. But I think if you even just check it out in your own experience, we can feel the difference between the experience of clear regret and guilt. The way that guilt gnaws at you and closes you up and makes you feel tight inside. And regret, which is a kind of clear sadness and recognition that I've done something wrong, and now I'm going to do what I can to transform that situation without getting caught in these stories about how I'm now a terrible person and the person's going to hate me forever and whatever the stories are that you happen to tell yourself when something goes wrong. We say every morning, I mention often, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tohoi, right? My God, the soul you have given me is pure. And we say that every morning because that's actually just the basic fact of our existence. Our soul is pure. You cannot make your soul impure. There's no way to actually make impure your basic nature. What we do, unfortunately, is cover it over with a lot of schmutz, right? So there's like all kinds of gunk on top of it. There's like old chewing gum and stuff on the windshield, right? So there's all kinds of stuff covering it over, and it looks pretty gross. But the amazing thing is that all we need to do is actually clear it off. We don't need to do anything to ourselves. We don't need to change our essential nature in any way. We just need to clear it away, scrape it off a little bit, right? And then that pure nature which is underneath just emerges, right? That essentially pure light nature. Thich Nhat Hanh is a wonderful meditation teacher. It tells a beautiful story of So in one of his early days, he had come from Vietnam to France, and he had in his house Vietnamese boat children. So some were staying with him. There was one little girl who was staying with him, and she was scared of falling asleep, and she asked him if he would be with her when she fell asleep. And he said, okay, but I have to meditate. That's my time to meditate, so I'll meditate for you as long as you don't, just or sit quietly there, that's fine, and you can fall asleep. So we did that, and she would fall asleep. And then one day she was out playing, and she ran back in, and she said, I'm thirsty. And he said, okay, there's apple juice. He poured apple juice for her, and it was like real apple juice, with cloudiness and everything, and all the bits in it. And she said, oh, I don't want to drink that. I've got all these bits in it, right? It's yucky. He was like, well, that's what there is. You don't drink that, you can go out and keep playing, or you can drink the apple juice. So she said, okay, fine. So she went out and she went and played some more. And she came back, and the apple juice had, of course, settled. And she said, Uncle Han, the apple juice has been meditated. I think it's such a beautiful story of the way that this child, just being in the presence of somebody who's really the master of presence, picked up, just sort of inherently picked up the nature of this practice, which is like, oh, you can just settle, and then the clear, bright, pure apple juice just emerges. Just to let all that stuff settle, right? And the rest of us just emerges. It's just present. And in our practice, the beautiful thing in nature of the practice is that I can say this to you, and it's a lovely idea, it's a lovely concept, but it doesn't really mean much until you feel it for a moment. You taste, even just for a moment, the liberation of awareness, the liberation of presence, that sweetness, that clarity, that purity. And then once you've tasted it, then you know that's a real possibility. We settle, and maybe just for a moment, in tons of practice, we taste, and we know that open clarity is a possibility which is actually possible at any moment. It's a moment we can always return to. And when we open to that, when we allow that place of quieting, of settling, when we accept ourselves, then naturally acceptance and compassion comes forth from ourselves to others. When we're able to genuinely be with ourselves, all of a sudden, being with others is not as much of a challenge. It's still a challenge. It's still a challenge of being with yourself, right? It's not just so easy as that. But it's a cumulative process, right? As you develop that self-acceptance, the places where other people you felt like you couldn't be with, or even you didn't notice you couldn't be with, you were pushing away, you were resistant to, there's a lot more space. A lot more space. I think you notice this sometimes for those of us who've been on retreats. You come back from retreat and there's a lightness, a joyfulness, a kindness, an openness. We talk about people love seeing the world through rose-colored glasses. But it's true. The state in which you meet the world transforms the way in which the world meets you. Right? There are very few facts just sitting there in the world. Maybe a few facts, like there's a wall there. Right? But most of the things that we actually do, most of the ways we make judgment, most of the ways we interpret and understand the world around us is about how we interpret and understand the world around us. Right? What is the lens we bring to that experience? Are we blaming? Are we judging? Are we open? Are we accepting? How do we understand the motivation behind people's actions? Right? How is it triggering us emotionally? And in that place of openness and acceptance, there's tremendous openness and acceptance towards others. And that comes to a great extent also from seeing your own sickness, from seeing your own neurosis, from seeing the sources of your own pain and suffering, and the sources of your own failures, your own violence in whatever way, your own anger. When you see it deeply in yourself, when you see the ways you act and the reasons why you act the way you do, and you can embrace it without judgment, so all of a sudden there's a lot more room for understanding and forgiveness of others. Or you can see somebody acting, and maybe they're acting crazily, But somewhere inside of you, you've touched that same source. Right? You've touched that same source. We've seen the ways that we hide from ourselves, that we protect ourselves. We've seen the way that we hide from fear or any kind of discomfort. And then we see it in somebody else. Right? You see them acting out the way they're hiding from their own fear and discomfort. And in that understanding is a space, a possibility of compassion. Right? If there's that space to feel like, oh wow, for a second you feel like it's not personal, right? It's easier to do when it's just like two people with nothing to do with you. The more challenging is when it's something actually to do with you, to actually still recognize, you know what, it's not personal. It doesn't actually have anything to do with me. It has to do with the person responding to just as I do, right? I can look, one of the benefits we have, we observe our own experience, we observe our actions, and we see, wow, I just did this. And I did it because I was feeling scared, or I was annoyed, or I was in pain, right? We see all those different reasons. And we see that it wasn't personal, actually, right? We're acting unwisely, and we have to take responsibility for it, which is a totally different issue. Total responsibility, right? But we can also recognize that there was nothing personal, there's nothing inherently malicious in it. So for instance, there's nothing inherently malicious in any action. If we can just recognize that there are causes for that action, causes that we ourselves experience, and then we can start to identify with them. And even on more, I'll say for myself, you know, as we are willing to really open to what's actually happening inside on a deeper and deeper level, we see generally, so the general experience is really my experience, parts of ourselves which feel shameful, right? Which feel like, it's like, wow, I knew I was angry, but really was I that angry? Or really do I have like this much violence inside of me? Or this much, whatever that piece is, or whatever's the most scariest emotion and piece for you, right? Because we're all basically human beings. And we've all had the causes of those emotions arising. And we're all socially conditioned, and so most of us have done a pretty good job, at least, of not acting out on it, and that's good. We want to keep doing that, right? But we also have been conditioned to actually not recognize the depth of a lot of our pain and our unhealthy motivations. And so part of it is just opening deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper to those elements inside of ourselves, and seeing that as we open to them, they're okay. It's actually okay to have that inside of you, right? It's actually much better to know that you have it inside of you than to be acting out of it with unawareness and unconsciousness that we see people do all the time. And when we do that, we get an even deeper level of realization, of identification with the suffering we see around us in the world. We see other people act out of it, and we can identify, because even though, please God, I wouldn't do that, because I have the ability to restrain myself, I can see the basic place where that came from, and I can understand how that action arose. And as we pay attention, we gain another benefit, which is our ability to not add suffering to pain. Right? There's pain in life, and we're all going to experience that. There's no avoiding it. Physical pain, emotional pain, death, loss, that's the nature of human life. You can't get out of it. But we don't have to add to it, we don't have to make it worse. The Baal Shem Tov says, when you're assaulted by what he calls psychic enemies, right? Enemies assault you. Our normal attitude towards them is to push them away. It's like, get out of my mind, I'm supposed to be doing something else, like davening. What are you doing here? And when we push them away, when we meet their violence with violence, we actually multiply them. We just make them more and more, right? It's a wonderful midrash about the plague of the frogs in Egypt. And it says, what actually happened? How did frogs cover the land? There was one massive frog which came out of the Nile. And the Egyptians were terrified at it, and they threw stones and javelins, etc. at it, and it split into two frogs. And they were scared of it, and they threw more things, and it split into four frogs. And they threw more things, until there were millions of frogs overriding the land, right? And that's what we do. We encounter something, it's like this massive, terrifying frog, or whatever it is for you, right? And what do? We attack, right? Or we run away, and it just multiplies. The problem just multiplying until there's a swarm and we've been overwhelmed. Or maybe we could go up and shake the frog's hand, say hi. Maybe the frog isn't that bad. Maybe it's just like a big green frog. Maybe it's kind of nice actually, right? We just transform our relationship to that thing which has arisen out of that river, that kind of swamp, right, of our sort of unconscious, that place of fear. This thing has arisen, and we could just greet it with friendship. What if we just greeted it with friendship? Right? The softness of friendship. And when we do that, there's a real transformation. Sometimes both the pain and suffering will just disappear. One of my most profoundest experiences of that was when I began practicing and I was suffering from depression, which manifested for me as intense anxiety. I was having intense anxiety. And my natural tendency was to run away from the anxiety, to do something that would distract me from the anxiety, pretty much anything. And as I started learning the practice, I chose instead to be present with the anxiety. What happened if instead of running away from it, I opened to it and I invited it in? Right? I just actually invited it in. I said, come on in. You're welcome. Sit down, have some tea, come on in. And it evaporated. Just extraordinary. But I was being fed so much by my resistance of it. The moment that I was willing to lay down the weapons, lay down my resistance and invite it in, there was no fuel for the fire. And all of a sudden there was this openness. There was an ephemeral quality. It sort of went up in smoke. This anxiety, which had been so intense and overwhelming, this tremendous sense of freedom. I mean, I felt like crying. There was just this tremendous sense of freedom, of liberation for a moment. Just out of that deep willingness to face it, that deep willingness not to run away. And this can happen in those maybe deep and overwhelming, but it can also happen in very prosaic moments. When I first moved to Israel, I found waiting in the supermarket lines very frustrating. For some reason, they seem to move incredibly slow, much slower than they had in America or England. And then I sort of realized, I was like, wow, okay, I'm sitting here, and what I'm experiencing is stress, anxiety, annoyance, anger, which is really not helping me at all, because it definitely is not making the line go faster, right? And it definitely also isn't helping me in like saying hi to the kupayit, right? Like I'm not improving my relationship anymore. So I started to do a supermarket line meditation. So every time I was in a line, I was like, oh, annoyance arising, great opportunity to practice, right? Can I just notice annoyance is arising, can I be with it more present? And it totally transformed my experience in the supermarket. I would still prefer a faster line, but all of a sudden it was not some kind of terrible, tragedy and suffering that I had to go through and go to the supermarket. It was just an opportunity to be present and practice. And we can see this really concretely anytime we sit in the practice. One very clear way to see it, often is experienced for us, is in physical pain. So most of us, if we practice for any length of time, will experience physical pain from sitting. Doesn't really matter what position you sit in. For those who start sitting on the floor, that's unusual, you'll get pain faster, but also we're not used to sitting totally still in one position in your chair either, so we'll get uncomfortable. Our back will get uncomfortable, our knees, our legs, our hips, whatever, something will start hurting. And our natural reaction to that, of course, is to move, right? To sit in some way which is more comfortable, which is not a terrible thing. But it's an opportunity to wake up. It's an opportunity to notice, it's like, oh, painful sensation, automatic reaction is to fix that painful sensation. Can I just instead try to actually experience the painful sensation without running away from it? Can I just invite it in? Just open to it. It's like, oh. And as we open and start to notice pain, we notice a few things. First of all, that pain is actually a multi-layered event. Right? It's a multi-layered psychological and psychic event. There's actual sensations happening in your body. There's actually only one level of the pain. And then there's a whole bunch of levels of resistance. There's physical resistance, which means your body tightens up around the pain. You can feel it. So there's a pain in your knee, your muscles will tighten up around it. There's emotional and mental resistance on different levels, which is again tightening up and resisting the pain. And if we let go of that, the pain is totally transformed. This physical pain, which was unbearable, is a sensation in the body. It's an unpleasant sensation. It doesn't make it pleasant. It's not like, oh, I'm so happy to have this pain in my knee, right? It doesn't make it pleasant. But it actually makes it okay. And actually, not even okay, at certain points, it can make it interesting. Some of the most interesting moments have been noticing pain in my knee and the way it shifts and changes and these very subtle kind of flows of energy happening within your body, which otherwise you would never notice and would feel terrible. And if you get really concentrated, it could even be blissful. Not because of the pain, just because of the fact that you're totally focused on that place. And we notice that we're creating this whole story, a whole mountain, right? Over everything we experience. It reminds me just a minute of the princess and the pea, right? So like she can feel the pea through everything. And that's what we try to do to ourselves, right? There's just like a little pea. But we make it into some huge thing that we can feel even through 12 mattresses. And because we don't want to feel it, we take 40 mattresses and put them around ourselves, which sometimes makes us not feel the pain, but also makes us not feel the world, right? Which kind of sucks. Like, you've got all these mattresses around you and it's like, oh, I'm like covered in all this cushioning, but like there's no world out there. The brightness, the sharpness, the harshness, the quickness, the openness, the sand, the gravel, all the different textures, right? They're just not present. And instead we can have a joy and awareness of these textures. Just thinking now I have a 10-month-old daughter, and she's always been kind of into it, but now has gotten more and more into it. She's developing into the books that have like the different things you can feel, like the different pages, right? So like very cool, feeling all these different sensations. And one thing that's interesting for me to note is that the books do not only have pleasant sensations to feel. It's not only soft, right? Like there is soft stuff, but there's also scratchy stuff. And oh God, what's the book called? Pat the Bunny. I don't know if you know Pat the Bunny, a classic. But anyway, great, right? But it has also Feel Daddy's Scratchy Face, right? Which is really not that pleasant. It's like feeling sandpaper, you know what I mean? But for her, it's all great. Like, it's just really interesting. It's like, oh, there's this really interesting texture. It doesn't have to be all pleasant. It's just like the curiosity of seeking out, just actually encountering the experience, because experience is so interesting for her, right? Because she's having it all kind of for the first time. It's like, oh, that's really just as interesting as the soft bunny, or just as interesting as any other part of the book. But to do this, of course, is hard. It's hard because the experience is painful. And our natural tendency is to want to avoid that pain, which of course is our natural tendency. And so it actually takes quite a bit of courage. When people think about this practice and it seems sort of very passive, and there's a lot of people talk about it as if there's a resignation in it. But it's quite the opposite. There has to be this courageous willingness to be present with whatever arises. The Pizetzner Rabbi talk about the Parsha ki tetzei l'milchama al oivecha v'natata Hashem biyadecha. When you go out to war against your enemy, and literally the pshat is, and God gives them over into your hand. But the Pizetzner says is that actually, when we have this warrior's heart, when we're willing to encounter reality with the bravery of opening to every bit of our experience, then God is given over into our hands. Then Hashem Elokecha beyadecha, right? There Hashem Elokecha becomes the object rather than the subject of the sentence. When we're really willing to open to our experience, to have that warrior's heart, then God is present, and the divine is given right over to us. The divine is just given right over to us. And so when we're present, the next benefit we receive is freedom. Real freedom. The Jacobson-Maisels Rabbi again, who, if you're new to this class, you'll notice you hear a lot about from him, since he's my spiritual hero, says that people talk about free will and having choice. But for most of us, actually, it's not a theological question of does God give us free will or not. Nobody has free will as long as you can't be mindful of what's happening inside of you. Because then you're just reacting out of instinctive reactions. There's no such thing as free will. Free will is only possible and only arises once we can be present with what's happening. We can stand above it and observe for a moment, right? What are the choices? What are the possibilities here? And then there's genuine choice. Then there's actually free will. And then we can actually make a decision. Oh, how do I want to respond at this moment? How do I want to respond in this situation? But normally we react automatically. We all do, right? We react out of our anger, our fear, our sadness, our hurt, our desire, our pride, our need for recognition. My friend Malcolm, who's Australian, says, feel bad, blame, right? That's what most of us do. We feel bad, we blame. That's like our natural response. Like things are wrong, blame somebody. Sometimes ourselves, right? But we're going to blame somebody. Some of our tendency is to blame somebody else, sometimes our tendency is to blame ourselves, right? But it's not just like, feel bad. How much is that? But we don't need to take that next step, which just, of course, adds more suffering and confusion to the fact that we're not feeling good. So it was just like, feel bad. Oh, interesting, feeling bad. Certainly in my own case, I'll suggest it for you as well, that when we do things we regret, and if we try to actually notice how we did them and why we did them, we're usually reacting out of some kind of emotional state, some feeling of being injured or threatened or scared or sad or closed. And the practice allows us not to reject the state. It's very important because sometimes people think about spiritual practice as being like, I'm not going to feel scared or something. I don't recommend that. I don't think it's going to work very well. But by being present with our fear, we can then choose how to respond to it. Right? Our response is not automatic. We can't choose what we're feeling in the moment. That'll just arise, although how we relate to it will affect it. But we can choose how to respond to that moment and to the emotion we're experiencing. We're not robots, right? We're not just caught into some chain of cause and effect. We can notice, oh, fear. I want to yell at my partner because I'm scared. But maybe I'll make a better choice, which is say like, Debbie, I'm feeling scared, right? That might be wiser than yelling at her. Right? But sometimes we don't always do that. But it's an opportunity, if we're willing to pay attention, to act with a lot more wisdom. And this is really the deep meaning of leaving Egypt, right? Of Mitzrayim, a place which is Tzal, right? Of the Yetzel Hara, right? That place of narrowness and constriction. We felt it. We feel how we just respond to this feeling of threatedness, to this feeling of pain, and we feel that narrowness and constriction. And we can experience the openness of the place of mindfulness, which is the place of, oh, I can see my experience, I can see my pain here. And I can see there's some spaciousness around the pain. There's a place to be around the pain. And from that place, I'm free. I'm not trapped in Mitzrayim anymore. Right? Anani b'merchavia. God answered me in the open space. In that open space, I can find the divine, and I can find the wisdom that's going to allow me to act much more skillfully in this situation. This is especially hard of parts of ourselves that we feel ashamed of. Because internally, or externally, it's very threatening for us to recognize that that part of ourself exists. So some place that we feel ashamed of, and it feels threatening to our very sense of self to have that piece arise. Like, I'm not that kind of person, or I'm not that low or disgusting, or whatever it is that arises for us around that part of ourselves that feels shame. And so our practice there is to really bring the intention of open investigation. It's like, okay, I'm feeling shame. can I really investigate this? And to do that, we bring compassion. Right? It's very hard to do that without a lot of compassion and care for ourselves and our own experience. It's like, okay, I see that. I see the shame. Wow, that really hurts. It's good to just acknowledge. It's like, okay, that hurts. My teacher, Michelle McDonald, would just say, ouch. So like, just notice it and just go like, ouch, right? Like, it's painful for me to start to see that aspect of myself, that aspect that feels shameful. And I really care about myself. I really care about my suffering. And now I'm going to really commit for the next 30 seconds to try to openly investigate that place of shame without judgment. Just like, yes, this is part of me, and it's helpful sometimes to remind yourself of things like, this is normal human experience. Because often, especially around shame, our thought is, I am terrible, and I'm the only person in the world who experiences this, which I promise you is not true. Right? It's like a good thing to remember that anything you've experienced, at a bare minimum, another 1 million people have experienced it. Right? That's like a very small percentage, right, of the world population. But like I promise you, whatever it is, at least 1 million people have experienced that as well. And they're just like, oh wait, this is what human beings do. This is what they experience. Okay. Now I'm going to bring that compassionate, warrior, open heart to the ability to investigate now, to open to that, and to really see what's happening inside. What's happening inside. And when we do that, we don't have to be a victim of our instincts and our reactions. We don't have to be in this prison that we create for ourselves, right? This prison of just reacting to life without any presence, without any mindfulness. We can instead be, as the Eish Kodesh puts it, in a place where our soul is in charge, where our soul is finally in charge. It can see what's happening, and from that place of its divine nature, it can make decisions of wisdom. And so to accomplish this all, we choose mindfulness. And it's hard work. Everybody's come to this class, everybody does it, knows that it's hard work. It's not easy. But it's incredibly rewarding. It's incredibly rewarding. And it develops the more you use it. So I just want to encourage us all, in whatever ways we're capable of doing it. Maybe 5 minutes a day. I started with 5 minutes a night, 5 minutes before I went to sleep. Did that for like a month or two, just 5 minutes. Right? It's not that long. And if you can do 5 minutes. If you have the opportunity and if you've felt yourself touch some of the feeling of this practice, to as much as you can find that time to practice, to reinforce, to take that time to strengthen that muscle. So thank you, everybody. And we'll stop